In July 2022, the temperature in London reached 40 degrees Celsius for the first time in recorded history. Runways buckled, train tracks warped, hospitals cancelled surgeries, and across the United Kingdom, the national grid issued an emergency alert, asking residents to reduce electricity consumption immediately or risk cascading failures across the entire network. Britain, one of the wealthiest and most technologically advanced nations on Earth, came within hours of a grid collapse during a single heatwave. No war, no cyber attack, no infrastructure sabotage, just heat. That was not a freak event. That was a preview. The power grid is the most critical piece of infrastructure on the planet. Every hospital, every water treatment facility, every communication network, every supply chain depends on it. And the grid that powers most of the world was not built for the climate that now exists. It was built for the climate of the mid-20th century. Cooler summers, predictable demand, stable baselines. That world is gone. The grid is still catching up. In most countries, it has not caught up at all. Over 70% of the world's electricity transmission infrastructure is more than 25 years old. In the United States, the average age of a large power transformer is over 40 years. In parts of South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, transmission equipment installed in the 1970s is still running primary load. The engineers who designed these systems planned for peak demand curves that assumed summer temperatures would stay within historical ranges. They did not plan for what is happening now. And what is happening now is not a temporary anomaly. It is the new baseline. Here is what heat actually does to a power grid. It attacks from both sides simultaneously. On the demand side, every air conditioner running at full capacity draws power from the same network. During a heat wave, residential and commercial cooling demand spikes to levels the grid was never sized to handle. In Texas, during the February 2021 storm, the problem was cold. But during the summer heat waves of 2023, ERCOT, the grid operator for most of Texas, issued multiple emergency conservation notices as temperatures pushed past 110 degrees Fahrenheit and demand shattered records for 17 consecutive days. The grid held, barely. On the supply side, heat degrades the infrastructure itself. High-voltage transmission lines expand in heat and sag toward the ground. When they sag too far, they trip safety systems and go offline. Transformers, which are the critical switching nodes of any grid, generate their own heat under load. In extreme ambient temperatures, the cooling systems built into those transformers cannot dissipate heat fast enough. They overheat. They fail. And here is the problem that almost no government official will say out loud. A large power transformer is not a component you replace in a week. The lead time for a new large high-voltage transformer is between 12 and 18 months in normal conditions. Some specialized units take longer. The United States has fewer than 400 spare large transformers in reserve for a grid that contains tens of thousands of them. Europe's reserve situation is comparable. If a major heatwave knocked out a cluster of transformers in a densely populated region, the affected area could be without power not for days, but for months. No government has fully solved this. Most have not come close. The history of how this happened follows the same pattern as every other infrastructure failure. The grid was built when it was cheap, and the problem seemed far away. Utilities are regulated monopolies in most countries. They are not incentivized to invest ahead of need. They are incentivized to minimize capital expenditure and maximize returns to shareholders, or in state-run systems, to minimize budget requests. Upgrading a grid before it fails is expensive and politically invisible. Nobody cuts a ribbon on a transformer that did not break. In the European Union, grid operators have known since at least 2003 that the network was vulnerable to extreme heat events. The 2003 European heatwave killed an estimated 70,000 people across the continent. It also caused widespread power disruptions that went largely unreported because the deaths dominated coverage. The lesson was noted. The investment did not follow at the scale required. 20 years later, European grids are still heavily dependent on aging infrastructure, still interconnected in ways that mean one national failure can cascade across borders, and still running primary load through equipment designed for a cooler world. France is a particular case. France generates roughly 70% of its electricity from nuclear power, which made it one of the most stable grids in Europe for decades. But nuclear reactors require river water for cooling. During the 2022 heatwave, river temperatures across France rose so high that multiple reactors had to reduce output to avoid heating the water beyond legally permitted environmental limits. At the same moment that demand was spiking, France's primary generation source was throttling back. France, which normally exports electricity to its neighbors, became a net importer during the crisis. The system had not been designed for that scenario. South Asia faces a version of this problem that is categorically more severe. India's grid is one of the largest and most complex in the world, connecting over 1 billion people across a subcontinent with wildly varying infrastructure quality. During the April and May heatwaves of 2022, coal supply to thermal power plants ran critically low at the same moment demand peaked. Rolling blackouts hit dozens of states. In some rural areas, power was available for fewer than 8 hours a day during the hottest weeks of the year. Hospitals ran on generators. Water pumps failed. The economic damage ran into billions. India has made significant investments in renewable energy, but the transmission infrastructure connecting new solar capacity to population centers remains inadequate. Generation and delivery are two different problems, and India is still solving both simultaneously. Sub-Saharan Africa operates in a different category entirely. South Africa, the continent's most industrialized economy, has been running a rotational blackout system called load shedding since 2007. At its worst in 2023, South Africans experienced up to 12 hours of daily blackouts. The cause is not primarily heat waves. It is decades of underinvestment, corruption, and deferred maintenance at the state utility Eskom. But the result is the same, a grid that cannot meet demand, with no short-term solution in sight. When heat waves arrive on top of an already strained system, the margin for failure drops to zero. Here is the part that does not make it into the headlines. The coming decade will add stress to every grid simultaneously. Electric vehicles will increase electricity demand significantly in countries that have not yet built the generation or transmission capacity to absorb them. Data centers, driven by the expansion of artificial intelligence infrastructure, are consuming electricity at rates that are doubling every few years. The International Energy Agency projects that data centers alone could account for 4% of global electricity demand by 2026, up from 1.5% in 2022. Every new gigawatt of demand added to a grid that was already running at capacity during peak heat events is another increment of risk. Some countries are responding. The United Arab Emirates has invested heavily in grid modernization as part of its broader infrastructure strategy, partly because it had no choice. Temperatures in Abu Dhabi regularly exceed 48 degrees Celsius in summer. A grid failure there is not an inconvenience. It is a public health emergency. The UAE has built redundancy into its system in ways that most Western nations have not. Singapore runs one of the most reliable grids in the world, with a focus on underground cabling that eliminates weather-related transmission failures. Denmark and Germany have invested in smart grid technology that can dynamically reroute load during stress events. These are not impossible problems. They are expensive ones, and the countries treating them as expensive problems are the ones that will avoid the worst outcomes. The countries that are not moving fast enough include some of the wealthiest on Earth. The United Kingdom has a grid that its own National Infrastructure Commission has described as not fit for the demands of the coming decades. The United States has passed legislation allocating funds for grid modernization, but the pace of deployment is slower than the pace of climate change. Australia, which experiences some of the most extreme heat waves of any developed nation, has a grid that its chief scientist described in a 2017 review as a system not designed for the future it now faces. The world built its power infrastructure for a stable climate. The climate is no longer stable. The infrastructure has not caught up, and the gap between what the grid can handle and what the atmosphere is now capable of delivering is widening every year. The next major blackout is not a question of whether. It is a question of where and how long the lights stay off, and whether the transformers that failed can be replaced before the next summer arrives. The grid was built for a world that no longer exists. Most governments know this. Most are moving too slowly to matter, and most residents will not think about it until the power goes out and the temperature outside is still climbing.